Canada has long prided itself on its official policy of multiculturalism and inclusion. But as in other parts of the world, there's been a rise here, online and off, of white nationalists spreading messages of hate. Here for more, Barbara Perry, Director of the Centre on Hate, Bias and Extremism at Ontario Tech University in Oshawa. Good to have you back on the program, Barbara.
Good to be back with you.
Let's just start with a basic definition. What constitutes a hate crime in Canada?
Well, legally, it's, I guess to start, we don't really have a hate crime piece of legislation. We have sentencing legislation so that if there is a criminal offense that's motivated by hate or bias, then at sentencing we can escalate the sentence. And then we have some propaganda offenses at Section 318 and 319 of the Criminal Code, which are around incitement to hatred, incitement to genocide. So it's very meager legislation, I think. But essentially, a hate crime from a legal perspective is a criminal incident that's motivated by bias or hostility.
This is a part of your business that is increasing significantly. I say your business because you study it. Let's put up these numbers if we can, please, Sheldon. And for those listening on podcast, I'll read them out. According to StatsCan, from 2016 to 17, there was a record 47% jump in reported hate crimes across Canada. Ontario saw the biggest increase in the country, 67%. We went from just more than 600 incidents in 2016 to more than 1,000 in 2017. That's more than Quebec's 50% spike, incidentally. These numbers likely represent just the tip of the iceberg, as up to 2/3 of hate crimes are believed to go unreported. And only 28% of hate crimes that did get reported in 2017 have been solved. That's 28% compared to 40% of other types of crimes which get solved. Who is being targeted in the majority of these cases?
Well, typically what we see is anti-Black violence, anti-Jewish violence, and then anti-Muslim violence, and then anti-gay violence as well. The two areas that jumped the most from 2016 to 2017, however, were anti-Muslim violence and anti-Semitic violence. So those are the two. Anti-Muslim violence, for example, increased, I think it was 150%, and violence against Jewish community increased, it doubled, essentially.
Now, does that mean violence against a person or defacing a mosque or a synagogue, or what does it mean?
It's some of both. The majority of these offenses, though, are property crimes, vandalism, graffiti, those sorts of things, which doesn't mean we should dismiss them as not significant. I think we know from the literature on violence against women, for example, that it's those low-level incidents, because they're so common, that really are sort of like water torture, drip, drip, drip. They really dramatically affect someone because of the intensity and also because of the audience. So if you've got a piece of graffiti on a mosque or on a synagogue, that really is a message to the whole community, and the whole it's there for the whole community to see. So it's not just targeting an individual, but it really is a message crime to the members of that group, whatever it might be.
Do white nationalists hate those different groups that you mentioned for the same or for different reasons?
Oh, I think there's a variety of reasons, and I think three of the common tropes or narratives that we've seen, and this is historical, this is not just in recent days, that especially immigrants, and that would include sort of a blanket term for Muslims and for Black people and Africans and Asians, that sort of thing. They're here to steal our jobs. They're here to sack our social service system and the funding for that, and they are here to replace us, white Christians. And those are the themes that come up again and again in different ways across time and across groups as well.
That was the chant in Charlottesville, remember?
Yes, yes.
The Jews will not replace us.
Yeah. And we saw it after Christchurch as well. A lot of chatter online about the Great Replacement. And when you're targeting Muslims in particular, keep in mind that's about 3% of the population. So it's hardly a replacement.
I was going to say, Jews have made up 1% of the population of this country for from time immemorial.
Yes.
And there is still a fear that somehow the Jewish community is going to get too big for the white nationalist community?
Yeah. Well, I think an indicator of that, or an explanation for that, is a poll that was just released this week that showed about 20% of the population think that Jews control, finances and the media. Still, that's an age-old sort of stereotype associated with the community. But there's still a large proportion of people who believe that. So that's the fear that they're going to sort of replace our ways of thinking and doing through economic manipulation and through manipulation of media images.
We've got, again, some StatsCan numbers that we want to share here, and this is about where these things are happening. 8 of the top 10 Canadian cities with the highest number of reported hate crimes were in the province of Ontario. And let's go down the list. You've got Thunder Bay, Hamilton, Guelph, then comes Peterborough, Kitchener, Cambridge, Waterloo area, Ottawa, Toronto, and Kingston. Those are 8 of the 10. You've got Quebec City and Montreal on the list as well. Any reason why these places would be inordinately having more bad things happen than the rest of the country?
Well, I think there are a number of reasons. One is these are also, some of them, especially sort of west of the GTA, these are also cities that see a high rate of activity amongst far-right groups. So they might not be responsible for the violence, but might be actually sort of promoting it in some respects. Some of them are communities where there is an active attempt on the part of law enforcement to reach out and encourage reporting. Some of them are areas like Thunder Bay, for example, that has such a high amount of Indigenous violence, anti-Indigenous violence. And I think there, what we're seeing is perhaps in part the community just saying, that's enough. You know, we're going to start to bombard the police with the reports of the incidents that are occurring. So I think there are a whole mix of reasons behind these increases across these cities.
It's interesting to me that 25 or 30 years ago, you would have read stories like this, and most of them would have been based in Western Canada. And these numbers show that this phenomenon has moved east. Yeah. Any theories on that?
Yeah. Well, and not just east to Ontario and Quebec, but also further east in the Maritimes. There's a lot of far-right activity down there in particular over the last couple of years. So I think it is an extension of that whole ethos that's sort of come to us from Europe and come north from the US as well. That influence of far-right populism that's affecting and infecting all regions of the country.
The Globe and Mail published an investigation last month. It was based on 150,000 chat log messages that sort of sheds light on who the new far-right extremist subculture, who's in it. And again, the home province most frequently mentioned was the province of Ontario. There's another chart showing this by a long shot, like by 3-1 virtually, over British Columbia, Alberta, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and down the list we go. We spoke with someone named Shannon Karonko, one of the journalists who worked on this deep dive. And we can't show you her picture, apparently, due to safety concerns, but here is how she described the subjects of her investigation. Let's listen. Sheldon, please.
Most of them were in their early to mid-20s. A lot of them were students. A lot of them were involved in their local conservative parties, and a lot of them owned firearms and guns. Most of these kids, again, seemed like they had come from pretty, normal middle-class families. They talked about a lot of their parents being liberals. These aren't really your typical kind of skinhead neo-Nazis. These are a new form of the far right in Canada.
To use her words, how does somebody come from a normal middle-class Canadian family and turn into a neo-Nazi?
Well, this is not unusual. I think that the far right generally is sort of morphing. The demographics are shifting. If we look at those who describe themselves as the alt-right, we're seeing the same sorts of demographics. In fact, older than that, not just in their 20s, but people in their middle ages. So again, I think it's the influence of that normalization of hate that we're seeing coming from the mainstream and from traditional politicians and from, some media outlets as well. So people are sort of buying into those sorts of narratives that I talked about earlier on. I think in places like Alberta, that's also influenced by threats to the oil industry and to the energy industry generally. So those are being sort of integrated, taken up by the far right as part of the crisis that's created by globalism and multiculturalism and immigration, all those patterns, all those hot button issues that are so important to them.
In this Globe and Mail piece, they mentioned a self-described experienced member of the Canadian Armed Forces who is also a misogynist, who is also in favor of a Canadian white ethno-state, and he encourages other whites to join the reserves in order to benefit from, the firearms and the firearms training you will receive in the Canadian Forces. Where does this affinity for guns come from as well?
This is one of the most dangerous trends I think that we're seeing. We first started to see it with the 3%ers when we were doing our research earlier on in 2013, 2014 in Quebec, but we're seeing it now in Alberta and Ontario. So these are, and they claim, outright online that they are former and current military and law enforcement personnel. And it is a shift, that almost American kind of rhetoric around the right to bear arms and to use them. I mean, many of these groups, like the 3%ers, are engaging in paramilitary training.
Why are they called that? Why are they called 3%ers?
It's derived from their American counterpart, the 3%ers, and it was 3% of the population that rose up to defend their newfound territory from the crown. So you're seeing that same gun rights narrative come through the movement as well, because then they're ready to defend against that inevitable invasion that they see, that great replacement.
How is presumably the Canadian military knows this is happening in its midst? How are they handling it?
Well, there have been very public statements about the fact that they're fairly quite aware that there is part of that movement that is infiltrating the military, or that sort of the opposite. People are being recruited while they're in the military to be of service then to the movement when they get out. So I think that they're on the verge of perhaps taking a closer look at this and trying to dig a little deeper to see, because we know it from the American experience, for example, that there's long been an affinity between the military and law enforcement and the far-right movements there. So no reason to expect it doesn't happen here. There's a very similar values orientation. The military creates an environment where it's sort of about us versus them, which is very much aligned with the far right.
The white nationalist movement in the States versus the one in Canada. Similar, different?
Similar in a number of ways in terms of their typical targets and the animosity and the reasons for that. I think to date, and we sort of want to touch wood, that the Canadian movement has tended not to be as violent. But as I say, I think this movement towards a guns right narrative is one that we need to be careful of in that context.
Now, we started this by giving a definition of what hate speech constituted, or an act of hate in this country constituted. The hate speech laws that we have here versus in the United States, again, who's got tougher laws, who's got easier laws? What do you say?
Well, I think we have more recently moved in the direction of almost that American absolutism with the repeal of Section 13 of the Canadian Human Rights Code, for example, which did protect against hateful speech. Without that, the propaganda offenses that I referred to earlier, 318, 319, we rarely prosecute under that legislation, and the threshold is very high for those sorts of utterances that they really there needs to be some evidence that they have the likelihood to incite some form of violence or concentrated activity against the named communities. So I think our legislation is relatively weak, and the enforcement of our existing legislation is also very weak.
Let's share some more polling data here, shall we? This is from Ecos Research, which revealed that 42% of Canadians think that we have too many immigrants who are visible minorities, i.e. not white, 42%. And when we break down via their support for political parties, the percentage who believe that there are too many visible minority immigrants was 71%, they supported Conservatives, 34% supported Greens, 28% New Democrats, 19% Liberals. What do you pull from that?
Well, it's worrying in light of the upcoming election, isn't it? The extent to which those sorts of views might, in fact, pull, sort of already right-leaning parties further to the right. And I think that the presence now of the People's Party of Canada in this mix, I think, is another factor that's going to add to that tendency to begin to mainstream some of these views. We saw that in the municipal elections here, where in the GTA, nearly 50,000 votes were garnered by people on explicitly far-right agendas and platforms, like Faith Goldie, who garnered 25,000 votes. So I think that there is an appetite for it there, and it feeds into those sorts of attitudes and that correlation between the attitudes and a political affiliation.
We should put that in perspective. It sounds like a lot of votes, and it is a lot of votes, but the guy who won the election got 400,000 votes or 500,000 votes, something like that. So they're not they're not threatening to win anything right now. Is that fair to say?
I think that's probably, well, I should say yes. At the municipal level, that was the case. But I think if we look at Alberta, for example, politics in Alberta in the last election there, Kenny went further to the right, I think, than we'd seen in some time, excuse me, in Canadian politics. So, again, and when I did a lot of interviews with journalists from Alberta during the election, and there was quite a strong presence by members of organized far-right groups trying to insert themselves into the political process. And I think we're starting to see that here as well at the federal level.
But if you're a political strategist right now, and you look at those numbers, how the breakdown goes in terms of parties, I guess if you're a liberal, you're thinking to yourself, I'm not even going to worry about that group. I have no hope of getting that group. Yeah. But is your view that if you're a conservative, you're starting with a base of people that actually doesn't like people of color or visible minorities, and therefore you might want to move even further right to curry favor with this group? Yeah. Is that what you're thinking?
Well, if you have, I don't know if that's the courage of your convictions, but it is a strategy that could be viable, right? To garner that, I mean, we have to look at what does that mean in terms of absolute numbers for support for the party then. But I think that, we also have to, they would also have to, walk a very careful thin line there, because I think there is still, much broader support. When we look at these public opinion polls, there's, a sizable proportion, 20, 25, 30% with a negative position on immigration and on Jewish community and on Muslims, those sorts of things. But the vast majority still are at least moderate to supportive. So I think that, you've still got to think about that majority vote, not just the minority vote.
Let's play a clip here. Senator Leo Housakos, who was on this program not too long ago talking about Senate reform, has some views on this. Let's hear what he has to say. Sheldon, please.
I would find it disturbing to believe that there's a politician in this country that believes that white supremacy is a threat to our way of life in Canada, to our communities, to our democracy.
Now, this was in response to Chrystia Freeland, the Foreign Affairs Minister, saying that she has been very outspoken about the rise of white nationalism in the country. How serious a threat is white supremacy in Canada to our democracy, in your view?
Well, I think it's a very serious threat. When we did the first study, which we published in 2015, and we talked about here a few years ago, we identified about 100 active groups. And now we're starting to estimate, as we're ramping up on our second project, over 200, closer to 300 active groups. And these are people that are active online and offline. And in terms of threats to our democracy, in terms of the divisiveness, in terms of instilling a sense of not belonging amongst immigrants and people of color, visible minorities, I think that's a real dramatic threat to that sense of unity that has characterized us. And I think in terms of the election coming up, I think it is going to play an important role there in terms of the rhetoric and the narratives and how that's going to inflame, more hostility, perhaps.
There always has to be a Donald Trump question as it relates to this, so here it comes. Is Trump the cause of this, or is he a reflection of it?
Yeah, he's, I think, a reflection of it or part of it, or perhaps, fuel that added to the fire that was already here in Canada. I mean, prior to Trump's election, we were already seeing signs of this turn to the right, populist right, with Harper in the last administration and during the last election campaign. Kelly Leitch as well, with her call for screening for Canadian values in Quebec under the Charter of Values, all of those sorts of pieces. So we were already seeing some of that, and Trump, I think, just added some legitimacy or credibility to those sorts of narratives here as well. Because the borders, I mean, the borders of social media and media are porous. So we were getting the same sound bites as Americans, and so not really distinguishing between, threats to America and threats to Canada.
So in our last minute here, as media consider how they intend to cover the upcoming Canadian election over the next 5 months, what would you like to see?
Yeah, well, I'd like to see more of the same. That is, over the last couple of years, I think the media have really been paying attention. I say, it's not a good sign when my phone's ringing off the hook, because there has been a lot of media attention on the far right, and I think there needs to continue to be. And I think that the media need to continue to shine light, not to let this go under the radar, not to let it go unremarked, but also then, I think breaking down some of those stereotypes that inform the public opinion polls that we looked at, breaking taming down some of those, not just the misinformation, but the explicit disinformation around contemporary patterns of demographics.
Would you give a so-called white nationalist candidate a place at a leaders' debate?
Ooh, that's a tough one.
Because Faith Goldie was explicitly not invited to participate in so many of the Toronto mayoral debates.
Yeah. Well, if they're a viable candidate, I think they have a place at the table, and so that they can be countered. But as you suggested, are they really viable candidates at any level? I think Bernier is the question mark there. Will
Maxime Bernier.
Will he be invited to those debates? And I suspect he will be.
Now, he would, well, number one, he has a seat in Parliament. Number two, he would say he's not a white nationalist candidate.
Yeah.
So he belongs there. That's what he would say.
Yes. And he can make a choice, I think, is maybe stop appearing on rebel media or, acknowledge that he is, at least sympathetic to the right.
Duly noted. That's Barbara Perry. She's the director of the Centre on Hate, Bias and Extremism at Ontario Tech University. Barbara, thanks as always.
Okay, thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.